So even as people are still trickling in, I want us to begin and welcome everyone. My name is Michael Zank. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies here at Boston University. Of course, I'm saying here, but I'm actually at home in my home office. So welcome to my home office and everybody else's home offices who will be speaking today. My major job is to say hello now and then say a few words at the end. We plan to end pretty punctually at 1:15. So at that point, I will say a few words again, and we will end our Zoom session at that point. There will be Q&A, so you will have a chance to post your questions in the chat, and we will try to moderate this conversation after a presentation of about 20 minutes. And here to do all that good work for us is the chief designer of this wonderful series of books at the center, Professor Abigail Gilman, and I'm now very happy to hand over the proceedings to her for further conversation.
So thank you, Michael. I'm Abigail Gilman. I teach in the Department of World Languages and Literatures here at BU. And I'm very delighted to be here and welcome everybody. I want to thank the Wiesel Center for sponsoring this series, Michael Zank and Teresa Cooney, the center administrator, and Jeremy Solomons, who is the communications coordinator and who is facilitating this Zoom meeting. And I also want to mention that this series is co-sponsored by the Leon and Alice Newton Lecture Fund in Jewish Studies. And this fund has given us resources to invite many incredible scholars of Jewish studies to our campus over the years. Today we will learn about the Bible with and without Jesus, how Jews and Christians read the same stories differently. Such a great title, just direct and to the point. Our authors are, first of all, Amy Jill Levine, who is University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies, Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies, and Professor of New Testament Studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School, Graduate Department of Religion, and Department of Jewish Studies. She is also affiliated professor at the Wolf Institute, Center for the Study of Jewish-Christian Relations in Cambridge, UK. Professor Levine is the author of numerous books, including The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. With Mark Zvi Brettler, she is the co-editor of the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Our second author is Mark Z. Brettler, who is the Bernice and Morton Lerner Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University. Among other publications, he is the co-editor of the Oxford University Press Jewish Study Bible, a book that I honestly could not live without. That book won a National Jewish Book Award and was called a masterpiece in a review in the Times Literary Supplement. He's also the author of How to Read the Jewish Bible. This book has been called An Eye-Opening Journey Through a Familiar Text, a Fresh Look at an Old Story. And I would just add that I can think of no scholars whom I'd rather learn about the Bible from than Mark and AJ. And on a personal note, Mark, I still remember a lecture you gave on the Song of Songs, chapter 5, back in the 80s. I remember it like it was yesterday, and every time I see that text, I think about your talk. And AJ, I discovered your work more recently when I began researching Jesus's parables. And honestly, I've never heard anyone explicate a parable as you did in your lecture about the parable of the yeast, which you renamed the parable of the woman who hides yeast in too much dough. Thank you for coming. And this is a really important book. I'm just thrilled that you came to teach us about it today.
Well, thank you. We're going to share PowerPoint, and Mark and I tend to piggyback on each other. So we'll talk for a little bit, and then ideally we'll have question and answer from the host or from people in chat.
Hey, so are we good? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Okay, good. Sorry, I just didn't hear you say that. The usual Zoom fun. And let us get started. Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is wonderful to be here. I wish I could be here with you in person instead of virtually. And it's really an honor to be part of a lecture, participated in many events at the center, and participated in some of the hearing some of the lectures of Elie Wiesel when I was still living in Boston. We're going to start with a discussion of the title of the book and this rather unusual picture that we chose for the cover of the book. The book really has several important words in its title. Perhaps the most important one is the word "and." In other words, what makes this book a little bit unusual, it may be perhaps even very unusual these days, is that it is not at all a polemical work, but it is a work, even though both of us are Jewish and Jewishly committed, which is very willing to realize the very elastic notion of the term Bible and the fact that for different groups of people, the word Bible means different things. Certainly the Christian Bible is larger than the Jewish Bible. And in the title, the word Bible really means both the larger Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible as it is reflected in the larger Christian Bible. And even this notion of Jewish Bible means different things to different people. For after all, in some cases, the contents, but certainly what you have in terms of order and structure of the Jewish Bible or the Tanakh and the Christian Old Testament is very different, as we discuss in the book. And finally, about the cover art itself. The cover art, I hope, really properly represents what we're trying to do in the Bible. It is a wonderful picture by Chagall of the three angels or three messengers who are visiting Abraham and Sarai, Abraham and Sarah in Genesis chapters 18 and 19.
Hey, Mark,
And
you might
might
want to
say-
put up the PowerPoint so people can see the cover. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, we good now? Okay. Thank you, AJ. So here you have the three messengers who are visiting Abraham and Sarah right there in the corner. And you might be saying to yourselves, oh, isn't it strange the way in which Chagall depicted them? For after all, these don't look very like they're very Jewish angels. The two on the right clearly have halos, which is very much a Christian tradition. And those of you who know the Christian, especially the Greek, the Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox iconographic tradition, these three angels look very much like they do on an icon. But that perfectly represents for us what this book is really about. Where a Jewish artist such as Chagall could take this particular image and create a blend between Judaism and Christianity. We're not trying to create the same sort of blend, but he was, and certainly we are fully cognizant in this book that the Bible has different meanings for these different religious communities and we need to think and always have in mind the meanings that it has for each of these communities, not to polemicize against each other, but to talk about mutual meanings which can live side by side. So we'll start now by talking about the origin of this book.
So when we're studying the Bible, whether we're doing it in the classroom or in seminars or, or in my shul or in a church, we recognize that the Bible is always interpreted in various ways. So we don't come to it simply, unless we're completely culturally uneducated, we don't come to it with blank ideas. A number of our students think that if we just read the Old Testament, here using the Christian term, that of course we would come to Jesus because everything in the Old Testament points to him. And they're surprised that we point out that, well, all those quotes you're giving us, Jews have additional way of understanding this material. And you can see some of that in the Jewish Study Bible, which Abigail already referenced, for which Mark was one of the co-editors. So you can take the Tanakh, the Bible of the synagogue, and you can see here's how the rabbis understood it in antiquity. Here's how Maimonides understood it. Here are some modern readings. So after Mark and Adele Berlin published the Jewish Study Bible and then a second edition of the Jewish Study Bible, part of the question was, what do you do next? So Mark and his editor, who's an Episcopalian, Don Krause from Oxford University Press, thought, oh, why don't we do a Jewish annotated New Testament, which would be sort of like the Jewish Study Bible, in which we would put the entire New Testament in its first century Jewish context. And we would also look at how Jews have understood the New Testament over time, because it's not as if Jews haven't been engaging images of Jesus over time, or Christian iconography over time. And we can see that with Chagall. It's not as if Jews have not paid attention to the New Testament, because interpretations of the New Testament have, for good and often for ill, impacted Jewish history. So in 2011, Mark and I, the co-editor, because Mark needed some Jew who understood the New Testament, published the Jewish Annotated New Testament, a fully annotated New Testament. All the annotators are Jewish across the Jewish spectrum, from very Reformed secular to people on the Orthodox side, and then back essays on things like, who were the Pharisees? How did the temple function? How did Jewish law function? For which we thank BU's Jonathan Clowens, who gave us a wonderful article on that. With Israeli scholars, scholars from the UK, scholars from Australia, scholars from the US and Canada, and so on. And then we started to get comments from people who were using the Jewish Annotated in classrooms, people who were using it in study sessions, saying, do more of this, do more of that, do more of this. So in 2017, we published a vastly expanded edition of the Jewish Annotated New Testament. We added about, 30 essays or so. We glossed books, annotations where people were having trouble. And in each case where we knew where Christian preaching and teaching kind of went awry, where because of a misunderstanding of the Jewish context, then Jesus was misunderstood or Paul was misunderstood. And the result of that was often a portrait of a toxic first century Judaism, over which Paul and Jesus and other followers of Jesus come in and correct really bad mistakes to say, no, no, no. Here's what the context was. Here's how Jesus and Paul and the rest of the New Testament figures fit within that context. So we thought with this text, Jews would be able to read the New Testament and actually recover some of our own history, because the New Testament is Jewish history, because part of it is written by Jews like Paul, and all of it has impacted Jewish history. And Christians could read the New Testament without having to misunderstand that first century Jewish context. And they could get a better sense of how Jesus was understood by his fellow Jews, how Paul might have been understood in a first century Jewish context. Indeed, Mark and I think generally, if we want Christians to respect us, which means knowing more about Judaism than a road production of Fiddler on the Roof or something about either the Shoah or the Middle East, then it might be good for Jews to understand Christian history, which means not only understanding what's in the New Testament, but also understanding how that text has been interpreted over time. It's a form of loving the neighbor and a form of loving the stranger. Mark, you want to add?
And we certainly appreciated the Jewish hesitancy and we certainly appreciate the Jewish hesitancy to read the New Testament in many quarters, which is why, as AJ said, this is a volume where everybody who contributed to it was Jewish in one way or another. And that's a term that I like to use, is we try to create a safe New Testament for Jews to read, with an understanding that Jews would clearly be reading this, knowing that no one is trying to convert them. And at the same time, we had a significant non-Jewish audience for this as well. And I must admit that even though everybody likes talking about imposter syndrome, I mean, I really do feel a bit of it like an imposter here. I mean, I'm a latecomer to the New Testament. I do not know it as well as the Hebrew Bible, the main corpus that I work on, but that also had certain advantages. And one of the things that I was very interested in, which might sound rather strange coming from a Jew, but once you understand the New Testament better, I think makes a lot of sense, is picking up certain points of continuity and discontinuity between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and often showing, and we'd be happy to discuss this later, how various elements or texts which are rather unimportant in the Hebrew Bible suddenly become much more recognized, much more important, and interpreted in very significant way in the book that is eventually called the New Testament. This whole venture has been a very exciting one for me, and perhaps nothing was more exciting concerning this when AJ and I had the opportunity, when she was already teaching in Rome and I was giving a few lectures in Rome, of presenting a copy of the Jewish Annotated New Testament to the current Pope, and actually having a brief conversation with him concerning this particular work and its importance. AJ, what do you want to add to that experience?
Just that being at St. Peter's Square is like the best performance ever. And the Pope could not have been nicer. His English was a little halting, but he was remarkably encouraging. He thanked us. He asked us that we should continue the work. And it was a thrill.
So in the short time that we have, we're not able to go through the whole book for you. So we would really like to focus on one particular chapter that the book discusses that is related to events that happened relatively recently, namely Good Friday, and a little before that, the Jewish festival of Purim. AJ.
And this is part of what Mark was talking about, is the recuperation of certain passages in the Hebrew Bible, or the Christian term Old Testament, that Jews may not know, but are extremely important in Christianity. Mark likes to talk about texts that are in 40 font size and in 3 font size. So we're sharing texts in a way, but how Jews and Christians have traditionally over the centuries read these texts has been remarkably different. So on Good Friday, which was this past Friday, the day that Jesus is crucified, the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, but not Luke and John, tell us that right before Jesus dies, he cries out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And you get this kind of mashup. It's Greek transliterated. The New Testament is written in Greek. So it's a combination of Aramaic and Hebrew, as if this is perhaps the dialect that they were hearing. Eloi, Eli, lema sabachthani. What this would mean for Jesus in Matthew and Luke can vary. And as we'll see, there have been different Christian interpretations of what this means. But one of the dominant ones is as a psalm of a lamentation of an individual. We know, as we'll see, that the psalm ends with the psalmist being recognized by God and the psalmist ultimately praising God, as if Mark and Matthew are giving us one part of the psalm and it becomes up to the reader to fill in the rest. But when you drop back and look at the psalm in its original context, which Mark is about to talk about, and hear the original, we get a different reading of how that psalm might have functioned.
And I'm going to come to that in a second, but just to highlight the extent to which this is a matchup. In Hebrew, the psalm begins, Eli, Eli, lama, which you're seeing over here in the Greek transliteration, Eloi, Eloi, lama, and then continues with the word azavtani, have you forsaken me, which is going to be, which is reflected here in the gospel in Sabachthani, which is an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew. So you're already seeing how many languages the New Testament is working with and how very complex this issue gets. Each chapter of our book has 3 sections, and we have three different types of interpretation that we focus on in each of the 10 central chapters. What the biblical text originally meant in its context, how the text is interpreted in Christianity, especially in the New Testament, and how the text is interpreted in Judaism, especially in rabbinic texts. So I'm going to begin by looking at the psalm and talking about its original context. And the first comment I'd like to make is that from the Hebrew perspective, from the biblical perspective, this is a rather typical psalm of a genre called a petition or the lament of an individual. Somebody finds himself, perhaps herself, being in a terrible situation, illness very often, enemies surrounding them, and calls out to God. These psalms have particular structures. The way in which this and the next 2 slides will work is the elements which indicate the structure are going to be in orange, and in yellow, we have highlighted various texts that are going to be important in the New Testament tradition that are picked up in various New Testament texts, as AJ will discuss in a second. So, like many psalms, starts with a superscription, often ascribing the psalm to David. Most of the meaning of these superscriptions is unclear. Happy to talk about this later. Well, if you're going to lament, you better call out to God. So this psalm begins, Eli, Eli, my God, and you had better ask God very directly what you need. These psalmists are not shy. Why have you forsaken me? And so forth. With a typical complaint, and a point I'd like to make is that even though this psalm is so important in Christian tradition, from a biblical Hebrew Bible perspective, it's a rather ho-hum psalm, nothing all that special. So typical lament you find elsewhere, you can't sleep, you cry a day, no answer, night, no answer, the internet is down, things are really bad with the divine internet. Okay. Then another typical element in many of the psalms is you have to give God some motivation to answer you. And so you say, all right, yeah, your ancestors, you helped our ancestors. Why can't you help us? Another typical element of these psalms is emphasizing the tremendous human-divine chasm. And I think that the function of this is you want God to feel sorry for you. After all, you're only a human and God is God. So God should take that into account. So what I call a self-deprecation to motivate God. This is pretty extreme, where the psalmist calls himself a worm. I think this is a case where you better be careful not to take this too literally. And as part of this self-deprecation, which will become very important in the New Testament, absolutely everyone is mocking me and telling me mockingly, oh yeah, just call on God. God will surely help you. And as this self-deprecation continues, this individual describes his terrible physical shape. It's actually very dry here in Jerusalem. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem right now. Mouth is dried up like a potsherd, tongue sticks to my jaw, etc. Some of you might remember that from other psalms. You have dogs surrounding you. Your feet and hands are either, depending on your translation or whether it's the Hebrew or the Greek, are shriveled or pierced. That's going to become very important. And people are so sure that I'm about to die, they've already cast lots for my clothing. Okay, I'm going to get this nice thing from J. Crew. I'm going to get this nice thing from LL Bean, etc. Then the individual goes back, calls to God, asking for aid. I would just point out, and this is so different than our modern prayer sensibilities, I just like to highlight it. People in Psalms are very comfortable speaking to God in the imperative. These are all imperative verbs. In the Hebrew, God needs more motivation. Essentially verse 22, you save me, I will take out an ad that says, the God of Israel has saved me. And that is understood as a motivation that is going to help God save the particular individual. And that is where this particular psalm ends. So again, to summarize the various points that I've tried to make, this is a typical biblical psalm of lament, which later tradition can either make more important or less important. It uses various stereotypical language, various metaphorical language, and of course, any later interpreter has to make the important decision of whether that language is indeed metaphorical or should be taken as literal. And with that, we are ready to see how this psalm gets used in the New Testament.
And for that, we can only do a little bit. So here's the idea of how important this psalm is in Christianity, the 40-point font, as opposed to the 3 or 4-point font. And just as a piggyback onto Mark's comment about psalms in the imperative, you can actually see that in prayer formulations as well. So even if you're Jewish, you're probably familiar with the Our Father prayer, which has those imperatives in it, like give us this day our bread and forgive us our debts or forgive us our sins. It's a standard formulation. So in Mark and Matthew, what we have, as we've already seen, is at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which in a number of Christian readings actually winds up being, in a sense, a fulfillment citation, as if the psalm were predicting that it would be used in this sense, as if it were written for the purpose of Jesus being able to cite it. And one of the genre switches that our book discusses is what happens when people read a psalm or they read prophecy that's targeted toward a particular historical circumstance. What happens when you read that later? That's part of the reception history. And very often we find in the New Testament, a psalm, something that's poetic, something that's spoken by an individual, becomes repurposed not as psalm, but as prophecy. So here's Jesus in Mark and in Matthew. And in Mark, it's particularly extreme because in the Gospel of Mark, as opposed to the Gospel of John, where the beloved disciple and Jesus' mother Mary and Mary Magdalene and some of the other followers are at the cross, Mark makes it very clear that when Jesus dies, he dies alone. His disciples have forsaken him and fled. The women who are followers are looking on only from afar. So for the Jesus in Mark, bereft of everybody, feeling completely abandoned. And here's some of those other pickups where the psalm begins to serve in a New Testament context as prophecy. Mark tells us that when some of the bystanders, and these are not Jesus followers, they're just bystanders, heard Jesus say, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, they go, oh, he's calling for Elijah. And that makes sense if you think about Eli as being Elijah. And I will sometimes remind my students that, at Havdalah, you might think Eliyahu Hanavi. So the idea of Jesus saying Eli could have referred to Elijah. And that made some sense because some Jews at the time, following from the prophet Malachi, expected that the prophet Elijah, who never died, that swing low, sweet chariot, so Elijah's up in heaven on hold, that Elijah would come back to earth to announce the Messianic age. And the New Testament actually picks up on that idea, so that the Gospel of Mark will suggest that John the Baptist takes the Elijah role. And then some of them said, oh, yeah, okay, he's calling Elijah. And others are saying, wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down. So could Jesus have called out Eli? And people thought, maybe not the psalm, maybe he's calling Elijah. But there are other ways that the psalm has been repurposed as well. So when we go to the next slide, which we do miraculously, there we are. I am incapable of doing a Bible study without citing some, great movie that I still wish you could get on Netflix. This is Richard Burton and Gene Simmons in The Robe. Some of you may be familiar with Victor Mature and Demetrius and the Gladiators, the sequel. So as Mark mentioned, they're dividing the clothes. I'm not sure it's LL Bean, but here's what John says. They took his clothes and divided them. They also took his tunic. And John tells us this was to fulfill what the scripture said. And here's that definite repurposing of a psalmist's prophecy. They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. And that last citation is a direct quotation of the Greek of the particular psalm. So what's the robe about? The Gospels tell us that standing at the cross is a centurion, which is a fairly high-ranking individual. And in the robe, Richard Burton, playing this centurion, gets Jesus' robe and realizes that the robe has some sort of spiritual or magical ability. And at the end of the story, Richard Burton and Gene Simmons die as martyrs, some of the earliest martyrs to the cause of Jesus. So that's just one example of the psalm being repurposed. There are others. And miraculously, we go to the next slide. There we are. So this is the smocking. As we saw in the psalm, they make mouths at me. And this is the ancient version of nanny, nanny, boo, boo. They say, let him rescue the one in whom he delights. So now we have really oddly cited the chief priests. And why the chief priests would be at a place of execution, which has questions of corpse impurity, on the holiday of Passover is really problematic. So were they historically there, or were they placed there by the Gospel of Mark? That's something with which historians wrestle. But Mark, who wants to have everybody condemn Jesus, Mark even has a full Sanhedrin trial condemning Jesus. In the Gospel of John, it's just a hearing before the high priest's father-in-law. But according to Mark, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders, they're all mocking him. He saved others, he can't save himself. Let him come down and then we'll believe. And that's a repurposing of that. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. So ironically, the chief priests, although scoffing, are actually suggesting that Jesus is that God who could, if he wanted to, save himself. The next slide continues this idea. Next slide. Thank you. There's a possible allusion to Psalm 22 in the Gospel of Luke, where the psalm says, commit your cause to the Lord, let him deliver. Well, according to Luke, and only in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is crucified between two other people with whom he has a conversation, sometimes called the good thief and the bad thief. The bad thief wants Jesus to rescue them all, but the good thief says, look, we're here because we deserve to be here. I'm not sure anybody deserves the death of crucifixion. It's a horrible way of dying. And the good thief says to Jesus, remember me. And Jesus says, truly, I say to you, the Greek is amen, amen, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And this is the gloss of let him rescue the one in whom he delights. And early Christian readers recognized that connection. The more you know about the psalm, the more the stories of the death of Jesus take on additional nuance. And we can find yet another one. And this is not all of them, but there's only so many you can do. If we go to the next slide. Here's the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is repurposed. We just skipped the Hebrews. Okay, we'll go to John. A possible allusion in John chapter 19 when Jesus says, I am thirsty. That could well be an allusion to my mouth is dried up like a potsherd, but it's also an allusion to an earlier verse in the Gospel of John when Jesus goes to a well. Well, of course he goes to a well. He's about to meet a woman and they're talking about marriage. So we see here in the Gospel of John, the motif in the Hebrew scriptures of somebody meeting a wife at a well, like Abraham's servant and Rebecca and Jacob and Rachel and Moses and pick your daughter of the Midianite priest, where Jesus says to the Samaritan woman, give me something to drink. So it's an allusion back to Jesus in the Gospel of John chapter 4, but it's also John's allusion to Psalm 22, because John knows that people in his readership group are already familiar with the psalm and they can put this in. And we go to the Epistle to the Hebrews. Like magic. Now I have to tell my students when we get to the Epistle to the Hebrews that Jews don't read it, and they say, but it's written to the Hebrews, to which I have to respond, well, it may not be written to a Jewish congregation, but it's in the New Testament, which Jews do not read liturgically. So here we have a direct quote. Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. Here's Jesus himself quoting Psalm 22, except not in the context of crucifixion, rather in the midst of the congregation. So the psalm has become so familiar that you don't even need it to refer to the crucifixion. Any verse will do, and any verse can be repurposed. And I think we have one more. Or not. So why Psalm 22? Well, in part, the early followers of Jesus are reading the psalm as a prophecy, and that's not uncommon. We find similar material of repurposing either prophecy or psalm, or even Genesis in the Pesher literature, the interpretive literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even in rabbinic literature. Taking verses out of context is not surprising either. It's possible that no one actually heard what Jesus said, because it's not clear who was at the cross. The people at the cross changed from no followers in the Gospel of Mark to several followers in the Gospel of John. But perhaps he simply engaged in an inarticulate cry. Perhaps he did cite the first verse, and in that sense, it would be citing it knowing that the end is the praise of God. Perhaps he did call for Elijah. We don't know what he said, and it's also possible that the early gospel authors were doing what Greek historians like Thucydides and Herodotus did, which is, if they weren't there at a time when an important speech was being made, they imagined, here is what the great man, it's always a great man, here is what the great man would say under such an occasion. For Matthew and Luke, Psalm 22 is exactly the text they wanted. But in the Gospel of Luke and in the Gospel of John, Luke has no direct allusion for Jesus citing Psalm 22, and John has possible allusions. Did everybody presume the psalm? Did some? That's up for historians to determine.
And now for something completely different, where I would really like to emphasize that the same words, the very same psalm, depending on your context, could mean something very different. And thus, the first point that I would like to make, if AJ emphasized in her presentation that within Christianity, Psalm 22 is a 40-point psalm, within Judaism, it's a 10-point psalm, if even that. Like, you could barely read it. It hasn't totally disappeared. It's not one of those things that needs to be reprinted into 3 points, but it is not especially important. And quite remarkably, even though it is so significant for Christianity in terms of Good Friday, the Passion, and Easter in general, perhaps polemically, within Judaism, it ends up being important of all holidays, for the most frivolous of Jewish holidays, for the festival of Purim. And the connection between Psalm 22 and Purim begins rather early. So something that is not well known, especially in the Jewish community, is that there are 2 totally different versions of the book of Esther within religious canons. There's the Hebrew Esther, where you could make the point that this book is the book in the Bible, which quite remarkably never mentions God directly. But then there's the Greek book of Esther, which has a set of what are often called additions to the Hebrew, which often mention God. So, for example, in one of them, Esther prays, "My Lord, you alone are our King. Help me, who am alone and have no help but you." So it might not be totally obvious from this particular verse, but many of the Greek additions to the book of Esther, which are certainly pre-Christian, repurpose Psalm 22 and put the words, the entreaties from Psalm 22 into the mouth of Esther. The earliest evidence that we have of Jews understanding Psalm 22 very differently comes from Justin, often called Justin Martyr, because he indeed was one of the early Christian martyrs, who in a book which AJ likes calling, or composition that AJ likes calling tedious, namely his dialogue with Trypho. Trypho may be a reworking of the famous Rabbi Tarfon, but there Justin notes that Jews refuse to see Jesus in the psalm, and more directly, the very important early Christian father Jerome, who is responsible for the Vulgate, which was the standard Latin translation used by the Western Church for many, many centuries. He said that the psalm should not be understood in reference to Mordecai and Esther. So that's from the very late 4th century. And obviously somebody is not going to make a statement like that unless the Jews, and he had many Jewish informants, unless he knew that the Jews at that particular point were using the psalm in relation to Mordecai and Esther. And here is one example from the Babylonian Talmud. So this is in chapter 5, after Esther has heard that Haman is about to destroy all the Jews. She's conferred with Mordecai, and she is going to enter into the royal palace at her risk of her own life, even though she has not been called. So the verse in the book of Esther states with regard to Esther, and she, Esther, stood in the inner court of the king's house. Rabbi Levi said, assuming that this house was festooned with idols, once she reached the chamber of idols, which was the inner court, in other words, right before the king, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, left her, at which point she immediately said, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. My God, why have you forsaken me? In other words, the Jews here are claiming, no. These were not the last words by Jesus, but these are when she was in the middle of her sacred mission. Or, given that the psalm has various animal images for the suffering individual or people around the suffering individual, a later midrash depicts Esther as wondering why she has some terrible problems. And she says, oh, maybe the problems are because I called Achashverosh a dog. Now, how does that connect to the psalm? Because the psalm says, save my life from the sword, my precious life from the clutches of a dog. Now here, the rabbis brilliantly deal with the issue that in one verse, the person asks to be saved from a dog. The next verse, the person asks to be saved from a lion and even from a wild ox. We can get there also. So how did this happen? Well, it obviously happened because Esther changed her mind. So the midrash continues. So instead, she called him a lion, as it says, deliver me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen, rescue me. Now, I must say, I have never been in a community in Purim where the psalm is still recited, but some Jewish communities continue to recite Psalm 22 on Purim. And this is likely, as we say here, part of a polemic mocking Christianity. You think that these are the great last words of Jesus? Well, I'll tell you, these Jewish communities are saying this psalm belongs to our frivolous festival of Purim. But I would note, not everything concerning the psalm in Judaism is polemical. Certainly there is some biographical understanding of the psalm in relation to David, as the superscription notes. And even though, and I really want to emphasize this, even though Jews were well aware of the fact that this was used messianically in the Christian community, some Jewish traditions of interpretation of the psalm took the psalm in reference to the future Messiah. And again, when we say this psalm, it is not the Hebrew psalm that is being interpreted, but rather the Hebrew psalm rendered into Greek in the translation that you have in the Septuagint. So that if you try to compare the New Testaments to, let's say, the Jewish Publication Society translation, or even some scholarly translations, you're going to have some trouble. So for example, this particular verse with the word that is yellow in Hebrew, ka'ari, which means like lions, that ends up being translated not as a noun, but as a verb, they gouged in the Greek translation. And this tradition continues in early Christianity, for example, in the post-New Testament period with Justin Martyr. AJ, you want to comment on this last little piece?
Yeah, the pierce thing could also come from a separate fulfillment citation in Zechariah, but one can take gouged as being pierced. So what happens in Justin's tedious dialogue with Trypho, which we wind up citing a fair amount, Trypho, the Christian, presents Justin the Christian presents his view, but his interlocutor, Trypho, who may possibly be based on Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was part of that generation with Rabbi Akiva, the Bar Kokhba generation at the beginning of the 2nd century, the end of the 1st century. Trypho might actually be expressing what Jews in the early 2nd century were thinking, because we can match up some of the lines to which Justin accords him with some rabbinic ideas. So we wind up with this, it must refer to Jesus, it can't refer to Jesus. One of the things that our book is trying to do is get around this type of polemic, if I'm right, you must be wrong, to say that when we look at these texts that we share, and here Psalm 22 is simply one magnificent example. If we look through Christian eyes, we're going to see Jesus. And if we look through Jewish eyes or Jewish non-Christian eyes, because the earliest followers of Jesus were in fact Jews, then we're going to see quite other things. But there's no need to engage in the polemical interpretation that has marked some past interpretation. There's some way today, Mark and I are hopeful, that Jews and Christians reading together can acknowledge the logic of each other's readings, and at the same time say, oh, maybe if we read together, we'll come up with yet a new reading so that we can move from polemic to possibility. The book engages the major places that the New Testament deploys its Old Testament, again, using the Christian reading. And that's how we figured out what passages to look at. What were those 40-point fonts in the New Testament that in Judaism might not be so large, so that Jews could become better familiar with our own scriptures, material that's not accentuated, and Christians could become more familiar with Jewish interpretations. So we look at Genesis chapter 1. Is there a Trinity at the beginning there? And how does Christianity understand Jesus and the Holy Spirit, active with the divine and part of the divine at the beginning of creation? What is that wind of God or Holy Spirit that hovers over the face of the deep? What does it mean when God says, let us create humankind, and who is that plural? Why do Christians traditionally see a fall, an irreparable breach between humanity and divinity following Adam and Eve's mistake in the Garden of Eden? And why did Jews see more of an original opportunity? At the same time, as Mark eloquently points out in the book, Jews do have a minor tradition of being born in sin, as being innately sinful, but not connected with the Garden of Eden. We look at the Melchizedek reading of Genesis chapter 4 and Psalm 110, hugely important in Judaism. That's, you are a priest. We look at the law code. Our students frequently think that Jews are doing this vindictive eye for an eye, and Jesus changes it. Well, in fact, there's a huge difference between losing an eye and being slapped on the cheek. Jesus is actually changing the subject. So how do we understand the law codes? Why is it that in that epistle to the Hebrews, we read that you can't have forgiveness without blood, you can't have atonement without blood? And what did Jews think about sacrifice and atonement? We look at the important Christmas story where the Gospel of Matthew quotes the Greek translation of Isaiah, behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a child. And how did we get to a virgin will conceive from Isaiah's original Hebrew? Look, see that pregnant young woman over there. Isaiah's suffering servant at the end of chapter 52 and all of chapter 53, the servant who was wounded for our transgressions and by his stripes we are made whole, which of course refers to Jesus in early Christianity, but has maybe 20 different interpretations in Jewish studies. The sign of Jonah, which for the church originally is primarily a sign of resurrection, but in the Jewish tradition, it's primarily a plea toward repentance. We have Psalm 22, and our final chapter deals with the title Son of Man, used in Ezekiel, used in the Psalms, used in the book of Daniel, and used by Jesus as a self-address. How might we understand this verse or this phrase? And finally, as noted, we tried to move from polemic to possibility, to the graciousness of trying to see through each other's lenses, to see the logic in the Jewish interpretations and the logic in the Christian interpretations. So that ideally at the end, we might say to our neighbors, well, I don't follow your particular reading for me personally, but at least I can see how you got there, and I can see how you find meaning. Now let's study together and see what more meanings we can find.
Thank
So
you.
the time is now yours for
We're ready
questions or
some
comments.
questions.
Mark, what did you just say?
Let me
We're
jump in
delighted to
here.
have questions at this
Let,
point.
let me jump in for a moment as to give Abby Gilman a little time to look through questions that have already been posted, and also to invite you to post your questions in the chat, and we'll come to them as best we can. I just want to first of all thank both of you for this really interesting presentation for now. And I think this was really a worthwhile exercise to walk us through one of your chapters, as you just did, to give us a better sense of what this book is all about, because it's really a very unique and unusual exercise that you did here for us. So this book is really an amazing attempt to open people's eyes, people, different communities, Christian, Jewish communities, and readers, and to show one another just how the same texts, or in fact, I'll come back to that in a moment, they're not necessarily the same texts, it can be read and understood, and how people make sense of these stories and passages in their own different ways. Now, in the end, you come to this assessment that there is possibility. We could look through one another's eyes and see how people arrived at these interpretations. I'm really curious to hear other people who are here. We have more than 80 participants. Does this work for you? Can you imagine yourself engaging in this kind of lens switching? And what would you hope to get out of it? I was surprised to learn that this book is predominantly oriented towards the Jewish reader. So it's like, why don't you sit down and look through this Christian lens and see how it works? Is that true? Is it predominantly a project that aims at Jewish readers?
I don't think so. Mark may think differently. I don't think so. One of the reasons I was particularly interested in this is because I frequently get emails from people saying, gee, Professor Levine, if you just read Isaiah 53, you would see that it was Jesus. Or if you just read the creation narrative, you would see the fall that Jesus comes to rectify. And I'd be writing back emails, because I'm good at this. You want to be polite to the people who are your interlocutors. I'm writing back extensive commentary. No, here's how Jewish tradition has understood Isaiah 53. Here's how now I have a book. So I can say, actually, if you read through Christian lenses, you're going to find Jesus on every page of the Old Testament, Christian language, traditionally speaking, and the entire Old Testament drives toward Jesus. It's all a matter of getting ready. It's the setup so that you can see Jesus fulfilling everything. But if you read through Christian lenses, you're not going to see that drive. It's not this linear sense, it's all moving toward Jesus. But it's more of a cyclical thing that it kind of comments on each other without having this forward drive to it. So I want Christians to read this book. So instead of trying to convince me to worship Jesus, as if belief in Jesus is some sort of Sudoku game where if you just had the right numbers, you'd get everything right, and recognize that faith is not a matter of logic. Faith is a matter of your heart or of revelation, but it's not a matter of connect the dots, where the history and the language comes in is once you got the dots, once you've got that belief, then you can use history or literature to enhance that belief. But the belief is not based on connecting the dots, because the dots can be connected in a variety of ways, and they're all correct. And they're all
And I
limited.
think, yep, well said, AJ. We really did have this double audience, and the same was true of the Jewish annotated New Testament. We really want Jews, well, I want Jews to read this particular book more. And a lot of the different subtle differences that you might be hearing in our presentation might have to do with where each of us is teaching. AJ is teaching in a divinity school. Most of her students are Protestant. I, for most of my academic career, taught Jewish students at Brandeis who, you'll excuse me, would not touch the New Testament with a 10-foot pole. And for a variety of reasons that AJ mentioned, including the fact that Christians are our neighbors, and it's incumbent upon us to understand the majority religious tradition in the country, and also the fact that the New Testament is one of the best sources of history best sources of understanding of Jewish history of the first century of the Common Era. This is a book that it's absolutely crucial for Jews to read. So as hard as it is, I don't think we really want to say that we had one predominant audience. I mean, we're a little schizophrenic because these really are very different audiences, and we're trying to do very different things to each of these audiences. But I could say to myself, each of these audiences has always been in front of me. And I saw one of the questions in the chat was, since I mentioned I'm in Jerusalem, and I've been accidentally been in Jerusalem for the last 13 months due to the pandemic. Yeah, I think it's really crucial that people in Jerusalem understand this as well. And we're very much hoping that this book will be translated into Hebrew and can be the beginning of a new understanding and appreciation of Christianity by Jews world over, without an understanding this is in any way attempting to create a mixture, a new religion, or conversion from one religion to the other.
Yeah, our general view is you don't sacrifice the particulars of your religion on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. Nothing says you have to have this kind of lowest common denominator, oh, we all agree on this. So what we're trying to show is the integrity of both systems. What else?
Abby.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking this would be a great book to create a book group around, and to go through the chapters, and I'll put that out there. Maybe we can do it next year through the Wiesel Center to really go through it together. So I'm going to go right to some other questions here. And one question, I'm putting together a question of Gordon Papert and Whitney Bodman. You don't have a chapter on the Akedah, on the binding of Isaac, Genesis 22. Why not? And another.
I can do that one really quickly.
Oh.
That's because the New Testament doesn't deploy it. There are hints of it, but it is. I mean, you think it would be major.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
Okay.
So you start getting it in church history where it's really, really strong, and then you start getting rabbinic responses. But as I noted, we kept our chapters to the major Old Testament citations that the New Testament uses, and the Akedah is not huge.
Right, and I would just say, I mean, look how thick this book is. Okay, this book could have easily been double or triple the size.
So,
We have various spin-offs on other related material. So we wrote on Psalm 2 for the Torah.com several months ago. So there's more that we can do. There is more that we have done. But I certainly agree with what AJ is saying. And it's surprising to me because I think one of the things that AJ is really saying is that Jews somehow think that the Akedah is paradigmatic already in earliest Christianity. And it isn't. It becomes paradigmatic later, and even certain images, which I was taught growing up, that the notion of Jesus carrying his cross is related to what you have in the Akedah, the binding of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, of Isaac carrying the wood for the burnt offering that is not picked up directly in the New Testament itself. So I guess as some people are saying we should have a second volume, what are we going to do next? Well, the second volume might not only need to have more chapters, that we're not rushing to do a second volume yet, but might also want to make clearer that this particular development in earliest Christianity of picking up and reinterpreting works from the scriptures of Israel certainly continued in later Christianity. And the Akedah would probably be a great example of a text that does not appear directly in the New Testament, but for a variety of reasons became important in relation to Jesus in later Christian tradition.
Part of the problem, this is Mark and I piggyback on each other again. Part of the problem is sometimes you don't know if you've got an illusion or not. So that in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a fellow named Simon of Cyrene who was conscripted to carry the crossbeam. So the big part of the cross is already up there, but the victim would carry the crossbeam. And Jesus is too weakened from being tortured by the Romans to do this. So this poor guy gets dragooned into doing this. In the Gospel of John, Jesus carries his own cross. So the question then becomes, is that an allusion to the Akedah where Isaac carries the wood? Or is it a correction because some people in the early church were actually arguing, or opponents of what becomes Orthodox Christianity, were arguing that it wasn't Jesus himself who was crucified, it was a substitute. And others were saying, no, he wasn't that weakened, because Matthew and Mark in particular portrays Jesus, as we saw, as my God, why have you forsaken me, as weak. In the Gospel of John, Jesus goes to the cross, basically choreographing all the events that are happening, and he is not weak at all. So is his carrying the cross an allusion to Genesis 22, or is it doing a host of other things? And there's really no way of telling.
Meira Schreiber wants to know, would you imagine using this book in a co-taught class on Jewish-Christian dialogue, perhaps for a non-Jewish demographic? Or how would you use this book? And then other people are very interested in the concept of interfaith and how your book positions itself vis-a-vis. This is something we're all familiar with, interfaith communities, interfaith dialogue. Do you have any point to make about that?
Pretty much
Hi,
everything
Meira.
has been on this. Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Meira. It's wonderful to hear from you. But we certainly can imagine it that way. I think a way in which I've used this book this semester is not in a Jewish-Christian dialogue class. And there are not a lot of those in the United States, perhaps, not perhaps, there certainly should be more. And I think this book could be a useful sort of primary text jumping off point for such a class. And I'd very much hope that it would be used in that particular context. But I'm using it in my Intro to Hebrew Bible class, and I know other people are using it in Intro to Hebrew Bible or Intro to Old Testament classes, because one change that I've really seen in the last few decades is a movement in such classes from being concerned entirely with what the text meant originally, using the historical critical method, to adding a concern of reception history, and reception history of all sorts, but which certainly includes not only what is often talked about now these days, reception within particular ethnic communities, African-American interpretation, Latinx interpretation, and so forth, but is also some of the earliest reception history, which is making people realize that the same book had very different interpretations, let's say, not only in the 21st century, but already in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century. And at least in my experience teaching the book in my current class at Zook, students are really finding this rather surprising. And I think it can also be constructive because, again, to use, I can't read all of the comments, but some people commented that one of the things that they found helpful about the book is that we present these different interpretive possibilities not as a zero-sum game. and and dealing with college students who are growing up and one day will grow up even more, for them to realize already at this point that this is not a zero-sum game. And when they come to their religious communities with that understanding, I hope the book really will be able to make some sort of impact.
Yeah, I'm very moved, by what you're saying, and looking at Jake Joplin's comments, and I'm sure this is a comment you've heard as professors of Bible, that people are studying the Bible, grew up in the church, grew up in the synagogue, were taught that not to ever question the text, and so the zero-sum game concept is not only about the reception, it's not either or, but also perhaps about within the text itself. And another person I think echoed many of our thinking when she said that there's just your discussion of this psalm alone, that there are so many layers of meaning, and there's so much power in that psalm that is, that become clear in the way you're explicating it and describing it and giving it the genre of the lament psalm. And so that's just some of the things that are being expressed here, which I would certainly echo. So I want to ask a question that I want to kind of just call out a really powerful idea in your book, just for the audience, from the first chapters. And while I'm talking, maybe other people might want to add a few more questions, because we have a couple of more minutes. I think you put it very, very well. You say that there is that there's a different logic. Use this term logic, that in a sense that that Jews and Christians see a different logic in the same scripture. And I love that term logic. In other words, if you read the Bible with or without Jesus, you're seeing a different logic. But the two communities nonetheless use many of the same hermeneutics and the same tactics. And you talk about the tools, perhaps, prophecy, proof texts, and polemics, that both communities used scripture in those ways, with somewhat different meanings of each of those terms, but in some ways very similar uses of those terms, that those three things. And I love that you kind of pulled that all together: prophecy, proof texts, and polemics. And maybe you can just elaborate on these tools a little bit, as really some of the central tools within both communities, and that they both are essential. We wouldn't have scripture or religion without them.
Well, all traditions do well if they have rules. So what are the rules that we play by? One of the metaphors we use toward the end of the book is something that we pulled from my earlier The Misunderstood Jew, is to talk about Judaism and Christianity using sports analogies. So in our view, we set up Christianity. What are the rules that you play by? It's football. All right, so football and baseball, there's a ball, there are referees or umpires, there are people on the team, they have to get from point A to point B. There are things you're not supposed to do, and there are things you can finesse, and there are things you can get away with. So in football, in the Christian reading of Old Testament, New Testament, we do, by the way, think Old Testament is an okay term, because we think we're both old, and old is fabulous. The kickoff is the Garden of Eden. It's the breach between humanity and divinity. It's the fall of man, or the fall of humankind. You get to the 50-yard line. That's the incarnation, the birth of Jesus. And the goal is the book of Revelation, the second coming, where you have a final judgment and a resurrection of the dead, and everybody's happy. And it's all linear. So you can see how Christianity, it's all pointing toward Jesus. It's all moving toward Jesus. And the analogy we used for the Jewish reading for the Tanakh is baseball, where you go into exile and you come home. And you can see that in something that Mark mentioned very early on, the distinct canonical orders, where the Old Testament ends with the prophets, the book of the 12, and the prophet Malachi predicting the Messianic age. It's promise, and the New Testament is fulfillment. And most copies today we have of the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, end with Second Chronicles, the edict of King Cyrus of Persia, telling the Jews in exile in Babylon, make aliyah, go home. And in some other early manuscripts, the ending is the ending of Ezra Nehemiah with references to God, Elohim, and good, Tov, which echo Genesis chapter 1, where Elohim, God, saw that everything was good, Tov. You go back to the beginning again. So they're similar, and they're both games with teams and balls and stadium with cheerleaders and rules and whatnot. And they're very, very different at the same time. So if we can extend the analogy just briefly, if we stop trying to force one into the other system, you must play by my rules, but recognize that there are distinctions. We're less likely to engage in a zero-sum game, but we can better appreciate the games that we are each distinctively playing.
Let me briefly pick up on that in two different ways in terms of your initial question. So let me talk about prophecy just for 1 second. So many people think that a great divide between Judaism and Christianity concerns prophecy and when prophecy ended. So two of the things that we point out in the book is that the notion that prophecy ended in, let's say, the 5th century with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi is a late Jewish tradition. And certainly Jews at the time of Jesus believed that prophecy was alive and well, or else Jesus would not have had so many Jewish followers. And this has not come up yet. Part of what we talk about in the book is also the tremendous contribution of the Dead Sea Scrolls for understanding both Judaism in this period and the early Jesus movements, where, for example, so we talked about Psalm 22 in early Christianity as reflected in all the texts which AJ went through. Psalm 22 is understood as a prophetic text. Some Jews might say that's ridiculous. Psalms is never a prophetic text. Well, among the Dead Sea Scroll community, especially in the genre called Pesher literature, the Dead Psalms is very much a prophetic text. So here you see something which so many Jews see as something which is uniquely Christian, but really is Jewish, though the Christian and the Jewish spins on these different texts end up being very different. And I'll just conclude by saying, one of my favorite ways of illustrating this is in a quote which I don't think made it into the book, I don't remember, but it's either attributed to Churchill or Shaw, and no one is really sure who said this, namely that England and America are two countries separated by one language. And I think what we're really trying to say in this book, and this directly relates to your question, Abby, is the Jewish understanding of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, and the Christian understanding of the Old Testament are two countries which are separated by one book. And I think it might take more than the single Psalm 22 example to illustrate that, which is why we have 10 essential chapters. But yeah, there's a really subtle dance between what we share and how we differ. And that's what we tried to bring out in the book.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, AJ. It is always wonderful to be in the presence of people who know what they're talking about. And so thank you so much for this very original and very special engagement for us today. My colleague, Professor Gilman, is holding up the book, and you have the link to the book in the chat. I want to conclude by saying thank you to Professor Gilman as well for organizing this